Focus on Southeast, a program on issues, events, and people impacting Southeast Missouri State University. I'm Dan Woods with KRCU Public Radio. On today's program, we have a special guest, NPR's Chief Economics Correspondent, Scott Horsley. He reports on the ups and downs of the national economy as well as fault lines between booming and busting communities. Horsley spent a decade on the White House beat covering both the Trump and Obama administrations. He's visiting the SEMO campus and NPR member station, KRCU. Scott, welcome to the program.
Great to be with you, Dan. Had a terrific visit to Cape Girardeau.
It's been great. Well, before we have a lot to talk about, of course, this half hour. Let's start with some of your background and how you got into journalism. Start there.
Sure. Well, I guess I kind of got into radio before I got into journalism. When I was in high school, I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and I worked for a couple of radio stations there that had started radio programs that were sort of aimed at a younger audience. One was a call-in show, and the other was kind of more of a news magazine. And I just found that I liked hanging out in radio studios and talking to people and being a part of this kind of interesting communication medium. And so when I went to college, I worked at the college radio station, again, just as a kind of avocational thing. I certainly didn't think I was training for a career or anything, but I continued to enjoy it. And that's when I kind of started doing more of the news-oriented programming. And I thought, well, maybe I should just see how this plays out. And I was able to get an internship and then a paying job in radio. And I thought, well, at some point, I'm sure I'll have to go off and get a real job, but I've been at this for 30 plus years now and I haven't had to get a real job yet, so it's been a lot of fun.
We could probably talk forever just on the simplicity, the beauty of radio. I mean, speak a little bit about just the power of the human voice for storytelling and for relaying information. It's very powerful, wouldn't you say?
It really is, and it also, if you're sort of a shy egomaniac like so many of us are, it's a way that you can oblige both those parts of your personality. You can be a little shy, you're not instantly recognizable to everybody, although this might change that, I suppose. Yeah. But you also can, plant your voice and your story in lots of ears around the world. Even when I was working for the program in Colorado as a teenager, and it aired at like 5 o'clock on Sunday mornings, I thought, well, nobody's going to hear this, but then it turned out my insomniac neighbor heard it, and my scouting buddy heard it while he was off on a hunting trip, and so forth. So, and I certainly was ham enough to like having people hear my stuff on the radio, and over time I've just learned that, yeah, the human voice, my own, but more importantly the people I talk to, is very powerful. And I think what's happened now is a lot of people have discovered that. For a long time, radio had kind of a monopoly on the audio storytelling business, and lots of other people have discovered now that that's a powerful way to tell stories. And so we've had this explosion of podcasting, and everyone and his brother now wants a little piece of the audio storytelling market, and it's made for a lot more competition, but it's also sort of validated that this is important work that we do.
It used to be that, a lot of people wanted to be a radio host. They thought they could be a radio host. And now with a podcast, they really can try it out, right?
Yes.
They can go ahead and do it. You don't have to worry about getting on the station in town. You can get some gear and do your own podcast if you want to.
Oh, right. And the gear has become quite inexpensive, and the technology has gotten better and better. So it's very difficult really now to distinguish just in terms of audio quality between, National Public Radio and Joe in his basement.
For those
hopefully there's still some distinction in terms of thoughtfulness and quality of content, but just in terms of the audio, the sound quality, it's not a whole lot of difference.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about NPR for folks who may not be as familiar with the network. Tell us a little bit about what it does and the reach that NPR has, member stations, and that kind of thing.
Right. Well, I'm based in Washington, D.C., and that's where we're headquartered. But the real backbone of public radio is the hundreds of member stations that we have all over the country in communities big and small, like KRCU here in Cape Girardeau. They are both antennas for beaming our national programming out to the local audience, but they're also, receiving antennas that we can receive how people are feeling and what they're doing all over the country. And so when news happens anywhere in the country, we probably have a member station close by who can help us in bringing that news to the rest of the country. We've been in business since the early 70s is when we were sort of set up as a nationally chartered organization. A lot of folks might have heard of our flagship program, All Things Considered. That was our first national program. We supplemented that with a morning program, Morning Edition. And of course, now we have broadcasting throughout the day and all, on the weekends. And plus, we are playing in the podcast space. We're big podcast producers now. That's important because a lot of younger people just never formed the habit of listening to FM radio. But they've very much formed the habit, maybe it can be habit forming, of listening to podcasts on their radio or their other listening device, on their cell phone rather, or their other listening device. And so we want to be both on the radio and on podcasts and on your laptop and wherever you get your audio programming. That's where we want to be.
And that can be challenging to try to be everywhere, right? I mean, there's a lot of production time, a lot of staffing goes into making all of that happen.
It is. I mean, we try to repurpose stuff so that we are efficient and we tell stories once and publish them everywhere, but sometimes you have to tailor things for different audiences or different formats or different devices, and so there is a lot of work involved, and at the same time, it's our radio audience that's still paying most of the bills, so we definitely don't want to forget about them even as we try to cultivate new audiences and new places and new ways for people to listen.
So when NPR started in 1970, 1971, a small little fledgling little network, but has grown to be a big player in the media space, right?
We are, and that's both, I think, by virtue of our growing and deepening our reporting resources, which is great. Sadly, it's also the result of a lot of our erstwhile competitors leaving the field. When I started out, for example, I worked at a member station in San Diego for 7 years back in the 1990s. When I first got to San Diego, there were 4 radio stations doing serious local news programming, and we were the smallest. Our staff was the smallest. Okay. By the time I left San Diego in the mid-aughts, 2 of those stations had stopped doing news altogether, and the lone remaining competitor was significantly downsized. So we've grown, but we've also unfortunately lost a lot of other people who were doing the kind of strong, serious news that we do. And it's the same with lots of other news media. Local newspapers have struggled. Television news is not as strong as it once was. Some of this is driven by changes in the business model and advertisers taking their business elsewhere. Some of it's driven by listeners and viewers and readers going elsewhere. But the news landscape has shifted a lot. It continues to shift. But we've become a big player, partly because we've grown and partly because a lot of others have gotten smaller.
Well, I want to talk more about the election results in just a moment and some other items. So we're going to take a short break. We'll continue our conversation with NPR's Scott Horsley in just a moment. You're watching Focus on Southeast, and we'll be right back.
Losing the fear of looking foolish comes with age.
Who did you steal him from?
Losing your way in your own home doesn't. Confusion with time and place may be a sign of Alzheimer's.
Mom, are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine.
Early detection gives you and your loved one time to plan for the future. Learn the warning signs of Alzheimer's.
Welcome back to Focus on Southeast. We're spending time today with NPR's Chief Economics Correspondent, Scott Horsley. So let's talk a little bit about post-election. One of the things we know now from exit polling and some of the coverage that's been done is one of the driving factors determining voters, their choice that they made was the economy.
Yes, and as an economics correspondent at NPR, that's not a surprise to me. Economics is always a big issue on people's minds, and it certainly has been in this election cycle. I knew that from talking to people over the last year, and I think when we say the economy, I think it's even maybe a little simpler than that. I think what people were really focused on was the high cost of living. You know, we've wrestled now with an extended period of high inflation. Inflation has cooled off a lot. It hit 9+% in 2022. It's down in the 2.5% range now. But even though prices aren't still going up as fast as they were, for the most part, they're not coming down, and that means they are at a place where they're a lot higher than people really like. And I heard over and over again people's frustration with the high cost of rent, the high cost of insurance, the high cost of groceries. And even though wages have also been rising on average, and depending on how you calculate it, the wages have either almost kept up or more than kept up with the higher cost of living, people just really are frustrated with the high prices. And what we know from looking at other countries around the world in this episode and other inflationary episodes through the decades, when the price of everyday living goes up sharply and stays up for an extended period of time, very often the party in power gets punished for it. We've seen that around the world in this episode where governments have been toppled, left-wing governments, right-wing governments, whoever happens to be in power when we had this post-pandemic inflationary spike, very often got tossed out of office. And you know, in this case, Kamala Harris was sort of saddled with the incumbent label, and she got punished.
Whenever you look at some of the potential policies from the upcoming Trump administration, there are a lot of things that have been sort of floated, some maybe not completely formed yet. But how much influence does a president have over shaping some of these issues, the cost of food and different things? There's only so much that can be done, at least quickly.
I think that's right. I think presidents always get more credit and more blame for economic conditions than they probably really deserve, but that kind of comes with the territory, I guess. President-elect Trump has has promised to sharply reduce the cost of living. He hasn't said a whole lot about how he plans to do that other than through increased energy production, which might make a difference at the margin, although keep in mind we've already got record high oil and gas production in this country. But you know, there might be some potential there for cost savings. Also, he's talked about cutting regulations, which could at the margin reduce costs to some extent. On the flip side, he's talked about slapping tariffs, 10 to 20% tariffs on all imports. Now, maybe he's not going to really go through with that. Maybe that's kind of a bargaining chip. But if you literally slapped a 10 or 20% tariff on all imports and an even higher tariff on imports from China, as President-elect Trump has promised to do, that would significantly raise costs for businesses and consumers here in the United States. Trump has insisted that the foreign competitors pay the price of those tariffs, but in general, I mean, it's not 100%, but in general, at least a substantial portion of that cost is passed along to businesses and consumers here in the U.S. We saw that during Trump's first term in office. He's also, of course, promised mass deportation of people who are living in the country illegally. Again, we don't really know how far that's going to go, what shape that's going to take, but if you literally deported millions of people, that would have a significant impact on the workforce in this country and could also raise prices. I mean, if you're bothered by the high cost of groceries, deporting the people who pick and process our food is maybe not the best strategy for bringing those costs down.
One of the things that it's with the way costs have gone up on food products and different things, I think most consumers have probably noticed the same size of a bottle or a bag. The bags are smaller and there's less in them, but the price is still a little higher. Well, will that ever go back? I mean, things could adjust. Will the bags get bigger and the prices come down, or are we stuck with this sort of?
Yeah, the economists call this shrinkflation. I know for me, I notice it most in my dog food. I have two pretty good sized dogs, and I buy the big bag of dog food. And I used to buy a 50-pound bag of dog food and it cost $30. Now I buy a 40-pound bag of dog food and it costs $50. I will say I've made a lot of changes in my grocery buying habits. I've switched from the Diet Pepsi to the store brand soda pop. I've switched from Hellman's mayonnaise to the Safeway brand mayonnaise. I've definitely traded down in a lot of ways, but Ribsy and Ellie, my dogs, are still getting brand name chicken and rice mini chunks, and they love it. And I'm not going to take it out on them, I guess.
You want to keep them happy.
Yes.
Which I have 3 dogs. I completely get it. So you've been here in Cape Girardeau visiting with KRCU and had a membership breakfast that you spoke at with some of our listeners, went to a Seeds conference about entrepreneurship and economic drivers in Southeast Missouri. What takeaways did you pull from that Seeds conference about Southeast Missouri's economy?
It was very interesting. We had a panel discussion this morning with some folks, all of them sort of in the natural resources side of the economy. We had a farmer, we had a sawmill operator, we had a cobalt miner, we had a cement producer. One of the things that, and it was really valuable because they were talking in very concrete terms about their business, their markets, what they expect from the economy, some of their challenges, some of their advantages.
Yeah.
One of their advantages for sure is the transportation network that's here in Cape Girardeau between the railroads and the Mississippi River that allow them to tap into markets all over the country, but more importantly, all over the world. When you look at, for example, soybean producers in this country, we can't eat all the soybeans that we grow in America. And even if we count the ones we feed to the hogs, domestic hogs and domestic people are not enough to keep up with the production in this country. So we need to export. We need to tap into export markets. And here again, we saw in the first Trump administration that a trade war can be really detrimental, not only by raising costs for U.S. consumers and businesses, but also making it harder for U.S. exporters, including farmers, to export their products. Other countries may say, well, you know what, we're going to slap a tariff on U.S. soybeans or U.S. bourbon or Harley-Davidson motorcycles or whatnot. We saw all that happen, and it was the trade wars are very hard on exporters. But it was also very interesting to hear about just how important those transportation networks are to reaching markets and some of the advantages that you have here in Southeast Missouri. That's always interesting to me as an economics reporter. I'm kind of a logistics geek, and one of the things that's so interesting about transportation and logistics is 99% of the time it's invisible to people who aren't directly involved in that process, right? We just expect that when we go to the grocery store, the product that we need that might be manufactured 12 states away somehow just miraculously shows up on the shelf right when we need it in the quantities that we need it, and maybe at a price that's a little higher than we'd like, but it shows up.
Right.
I mean, if you think toilet paper is expensive, remember when we didn't have it. That's worse.
Right.
And the logistics network it's a miracle, and we only really think a lot about it, those of us who aren't directly involved in the business, when there's a hiccup. When, for example, dock workers on the East Coast go on strike, and we're suddenly faced with the prospect that, what if we can't get bananas because all the bananas come through the port of Wilmington, and if they're not getting unloaded in about 3 weeks' time, there might not be any more bananas on the shelf at the supermarket. Or a manufacturer that's waiting for component parts that are coming over from Europe on a ship, and if they don't get there, they're going to have to shut down an assembly line in the Midwest someplace. So we don't think about those most of the time, but they're critically important, and it was interesting to hear these folks talk about it. Some of them, that's a man-made thing when we have a labor dispute. We've seen on the Mississippi River in recent times when water levels have fallen so low that the barges have to carry only half as much as they ordinarily would. Last year we saw significant slowdowns in the Panama Canal, also because of drought, maybe more severe drought. You shut off the Panama Canal, folks either have to go a long way around or they wait and they go much more slowly. Of course, we've had national security problems in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels taking aim at shipping over there. All these trade routes, both domestic and international, that most of the time we just kind of take for granted, and then we get a reminder every so often that those can have hiccups, and then we all if we're lucky, all we face is a slightly higher price. If we're unlucky, we face real shortages.
Yeah. Let's pause for another moment and take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with NPR's Scott Horsley. You're watching Focus on Southeast. We'll be right back.
Everyone has a ritual, that small thing that keeps us focused.
A habit we never skip.
to clear our minds and elevate our performance.
But what do you do to keep your head in the game, to drown out that self-doubt and support your mental health? Because being your best isn't just about taking care of your body.
It's about taking care of your mind and your mental health.
Discover the resources that you need to keep your mind focused and your mental health a priority.
Welcome back to Focus on Southeast. On today's program, we have a special guest, NPR's Chief Economics Correspondent, Scott Horsley. So we talked a little about some of the things you learned from Southeast Missouri's economy, and we had some information from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. May speak to that a little bit, and what jumped out at you from his presentation?
Yeah, we had a terrific kind of economic status check from the economists from the St. Louis Fed, and of course that's one of 12 regional Fed banks around the country who are a little bit like public radio stations. They serve as kind of the on-the-ground, nerve system of the Federal Reserve, kind of keeping an ear to their local economies and reporting upstream to the bosses in Washington about how things are really going, and it's really valuable. Part of my job as Chief Economics Correspondent is to track the movements of the Federal Reserve, and here again it's a little bit like the logistics system. When everything's great, nobody has to pay too much attention to the Federal Reserve. We just assume that the money gets printed and the coins show up where they need to be, and then when something like the pandemic happens and we run out of coins, everyone's panicking, and when inflation takes off, the Fed has to crack the whip with higher interest rates to try to get prices under control. And so that's part of my job, is to keep tabs on the Fed, and they have an awful lot of economists who are keeping tabs on the rest of the economy.
Talk a little bit about the Fed, specifically with the chairman, Jerome Powell, and his relationship with the incoming president, because there's been a little talk about President-elect would like to get rid of Jerome Powell. Powell says he can't. Talk a little bit about their relationship from the first term, and I guess, and what may happen in this upcoming administration.
Sure. Well, it was Donald Trump who appointed Jerome Powell as Fed chairman the last time he was in the White House. Powell was initially appointed to the Federal Reserve by former President Barack Obama, but he was elevated to the chairman's post by Donald Trump over Janet Yellen, who had been Fed chair at the time, and I think Trump felt like Jay Powell looked more like a Fed chairman than he thought Janet Yellen did. He's tall, distinguished looking, gray hair. Silver hair, I should say, and Jerome Powell has broad bipartisan respect on Capitol Hill. I think he'd be the first to admit that the Fed missed it a little bit, that they were too late to respond to soaring prices. They, like lots of other economists, thought that the inflation that we saw at the beginning in 2021 was transitory. It would come and go, and that they shouldn't overreact and raise interest rates, and they I think, by common assessment, that turned out to be a misjudgment, and they'll take their lumps for that. But I think since then they've responded pretty well to get prices back under control, and either through great talent or great luck, or mostly probably some combination of the two, we've seemed to be on the verge of achieving a soft landing, which is to say getting inflation down without tipping the economy into a recession. Nevertheless, President-elect Trump has sort of bristled at the idea of Fed independence, with the notion that the Fed should operate independently of the president, and the reason that the Fed was granted that independence was sometimes you got to make unpopular decisions as the Federal Reserve. You got to raise interest rates, which nobody likes, but in the long term is the right thing to do for the economy. It's also usually painful for the president, whoever happens to be in office. They often get penalized for rising interest rates. So the idea was to insulate the central bank from the political people who might not have the fortitude to make the tough decisions and the unpopular decisions. But Donald Trump has definitely bucked the idea of Fed independence, and Jerome Powell has been a defender of Fed independence. I think Jerome Powell's trying hard not to provoke the president. He's not in any way picking a fight with Donald Trump, but he has sort of said, well, if Donald Trump picks a fight, he said, it's been dragged out of Jerome Powell that if Donald Trump picks a fight with him, he will defend the Fed's independence. And that's sort of where things stand.
So we got about 90 seconds or so. I wanted to ask you about a special bike sort of tour that you take.
I've got my bicycle tie on today.
Tell us about that.
Well, you know, the Des Moines Register sponsors this wonderful bike ride across Iowa every summer. You start on the Missouri River side and you go 400 or 500 miles across the state and end up dipping your tires in the Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And we first did it in 2013. We call our NPR team the No Pie Refuse team. You sort of eat your way across the state. And we thought we'd just do it once, but it's been so much fun that we've done it almost every year since. And I'm coming up on it'll be my 11th RAGBRAI next summer. It's always the highlight of my year. And one reason is, you know, you just can't beat a chance to get out of Washington and come somewhere in the heartland of America and spend some time with people, and it kind of restores your faith in humanity, much like a visit to Cape Girardeau. And
and some of your colleagues ride with you, some folks that for me with NPR might recognize those voices. And I would imagine this is a chance to maybe talk with some folks which may influence and help some ideas for future stories. Are you reporting?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we don't spend the whole week talking shop, but there's a lot of time to chat as you're bicycling 400, 500 miles, and absolutely people have suggested stories, and we've done stories on the radio about things that we observed in Iowa, just as I'll probably try to craft a few stories out of the things I've observed here in Missouri.
Yeah. Well, Scott, it's been a real treat to have you in Cape Girardeau, and we're so thankful that you were able to be on our television program as well, so thanks again for being here.
It's my pleasure.
Focus on Southeast is a collaboration of KRCU Public Radio and the Department of Mass Media here at Southeast Missouri State University. Just a reminder that portions of these conversations will be broadcast on KRCU Public Radio and will also be available online at krcu.org and on the station's YouTube channel. From the Russ Center for Media, I'm Dan Woods. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to tune in next time when we focus on Southeast.